Hi, everybody. It's very nice to see everybody here this evening. My name is Charles Duggan. I'm the Heritage Officer with Dublin City Council, and delighted to be bringing this evening to you. So we're grateful to the Irish Georgian Society for making this beautiful historic space available to us, and to my colleague Abigail O'Reilly, who has been working behind the scenes to help organise tonight's event. I also want to acknowledge our two ISL interpreters, Sarah Garvey and Vanessa O'Connell. So this evening has two closely connected parts. First, we'll hear a lecture from Dr Averill Earls to celebrate the Irish launch of her newly published book, Love and the Lav, A Social Biography of Same-Sex Desire in Ireland, 1922 to 1972. And following that, Averill will be joined by two fellow historians for a panel discussion that will allow us to reflect more broadly on queer history, archives and remembrance, including the launch of a new oral history initiative here in Dublin. So, Love in the Lav, which is for sale at the back of the room, and I'm going to mention that a few times, is more than a work of history. It is an investigation into how same-sex desiring men found ways to live, connect and love in an era when their very existence was policed and marginalised. Through meticulous research in police records and family archives, Averill reconstructs the lives of both ordinary citizens and public figures, revealing the hidden subcultures of 20th century Ireland. When Kieran Rose introduced Averill at a lecture we organised exactly 2 years ago, he spoke about how her research acts as a form of remembrance, remembering those who were victimised through the policing of their sexuality from the 1880s through to the founding of the Irish gay rights movement in 1974. And while there has been a strong and important research on the period after 1974, we knew remarkably little about the lived experience of LGBT plus people before that point in Irish history. So what Averill has done through this book is really something quite extraordinary and a huge contribution not only to our understanding of the past, but to the wider history of LGBT life in Ireland. And as I said, copies of Love in the Lav are available for purchase this evening, courtesy of Jack from Hodges Figgis, and we really strongly recommend that you get a copy and another for a friend. So the idea of remembrance and of ensuring that lives, experiences and stories are not lost also brings me to another important reason we are gathered here this evening. So we are delighted to use this platform to announce Remembrance and Reminiscence, the Dublin City Queer Oral History Project. This pilot project seeks to preserve the ordinary lived experience of LGBTQ plus community in late 20th century Dublin. These stories will be archived in the Digital Repository of Ireland, ensuring that they are preserved and accessible for future generations. The Oral History Project connects directly with many of the themes raised by Averill's work, particularly the importance of recording experiences that were often undocumented, overlooked, or deliberately silenced. And we will return to this project during the panel discussion this evening. And we would really value your help in promoting it. So please pick up a flyer if you haven't already, and encourage anyone you know with lived experience of late 20th century Dublin to consider taking part. So to begin our evening, we are pleased to welcome our author, Dr Averill Earls. Averill is an associate professor of history in St. Olaf's College in Minnesota. She is also known as the executive producer of Dig, a history podcast, an award-winning academic writer, and I understand from her biography, an award-winning baker. Following her lecture, Averill will be joined for a panel discussion by two leading voices in queer Irish history. Dr Páraic Kerrigan is an assistant professor at University College Dublin and the author of the Irish Times bestseller, Reeling in the Queers. His forthcoming work, Waking the Hirschfield, continues his deep engagement in Dublin's queer archival history. And Dr Tom Hulme is a history lecturer at Queen's University Belfast. He leads the Queer Northern Ireland Sexuality Before Liberation project and is the author of a forthcoming book, Belfast Men, An Intimate History of Life Before Gay Liberation, published by Cornell University Press. So without further ado, will you please join me in welcoming Dr Averill Earls.
Jesus. Thank you. All right.
I'll set that there. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to Dublin City Council and Charles and Abby for inviting me back to the Heritage Series, to Tom and Páraic for agreeing to sit down and chat with me for the majority of the program. And to each of you for coming to an academic book talk on a Friday night. Hopefully we can go to a pub after this and actually enjoy our Friday in the city. I'm here in Dublin also because I'm leading a group of students from St. Olaf College in Minnesota. We go home on Tuesday. We've been here since January 4th. So we're going home for better or worse. I'm sure you can understand why the worst would be there. But these students have been in the archives over the last 20 days doing more of this crucial work in the history of sexuality, investigating and writing the histories of Irish sexuality and sex, and I'm so honored so many of them, like a lot of them, chose to come here on their precious night off. I really told them it was 100% optional, and still too many of them came. So let's begin. The last time, let's see. Sorry. That's my current obsession. Sorry. The last time I gave a talk for DCC in the Heritage series at the Mansion House, I included a good bit of background about the history of sex between men and the policing of sex between men in Dublin. And if you missed that, which probably a lot of you did, the quick and dirty context is that sex between men, public or private, was illegal in Ireland until 1993. Under a British law, the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, any intimacy between men could be grounds for arrest, trial, and imprisonment, up to 2 years hard labor. This was a slightly less harsh law than the pre-existing legislation from 1861 that made sodomy, generally anal sex, punishable with up to life imprisonment. And then that 1861 was slightly better than the previous sodomy laws, which were death, right? But the 1885 laws, vague language meant that defining what gross indecency was up to the guards, the attorney general, the jury, and the judge. For the most part, the 1885 law wasn't used all that much in Ireland. The Royal Irish Constabulary didn't bother much with what was almost certainly a vibrant cruising scene in Dublin, unless there were kids involved and a parent or other adult intervened. And that's an important sort of caveat, because gross indecency could also be any sexual contact between males, regardless of age. So sexual assaults of boys were adjudicated under the same law, which really sort of made things quite messy, right? It made things messy for them, it made things messy for me as a historian looking at it now. But after independence, the newly formed Garda Síochána took up the mantle of clearing the streets of sin and vice, which mostly meant female sex workers and the predominantly working class men who used the city's public spaces for sex. And this is where my work comes in. Those laws and the moments in which guards cracked down on visible queerness in the streets of Dublin created a sort of record that formed the basis of my research. At my last public talk in Dublin, I shared the story of James Hand, a cabbie who was a terrible gossip and hired rent boys for his friends and hosted them in his home, and who was the subject of a year-long surveillance operation that ultimately led to his conviction of gross indecency. He was caught first with his lover, Michael Corr, and then also of procurement, or as the judge said, for running a male brothel. He spent something like 10 years in prison for this, and then disappeared from public records. I also told you a little bit about Micheál MacLiamore and Hilton Edwards, the Englishmen who invigorated the Irish language theatre in Dublin, who rubbed elbows with the likes of Orson Welles, and who lived together on Harcourt Terrace for nearly 50 years as a couple. I won't rehash those stories tonight because I've only got 25 minutes. And you can go to the DCC YouTube page to watch my hour-long ramble about these stories. Tonight I'll very briefly tell you about the research project that became Love in the Lav and share some snippets from the book. And then I'll end with a beginning. I'm gonna read a little excerpt from the introduction of my book, as if I was a real author. Like you would go to a book reading, I think. That's the thing that real authors do. I've always dreamed that I could one day be a real author. And then afterwards, I'll slide over and Páraic and Tom and I will chat for a little bit, and hopefully you'll have some questions as well. And I brought a very nice, let me see if I can find it, teal gel pen. So to continue living out my dream of being a real author, if anyone wants their book signed, I have that just ready, okay? Good. So we'll start at the beginning. I was not meant to be a historian, not at all. At the University of Vermont, I studied political science and Middle Eastern studies, and I was teaching myself Arabic because our school did not have any language programs for that. I wanted to be in the foreign service, and I wanted to eventually work on policy or for an embassy. But I was also really passionate about social justice, and particularly LGBTQ rights, and when I ran out of poli-sci classes, I decided to start taking history classes for fun because I was good at it. I got good marks in it, and they were fun, right? Somehow, I managed to get a coveted spot in Paul Delon's Sex and Modern History, which was like, there was a wait list out the door. It was like 40 people waiting to get on this class. I got in my junior year. And that class like exploded my brain. Once I knew that there was a history of sex that people could study for a living, I just wanted to keep doing it. That was like all new doors opened up for me. And then I decided, well, I'm gonna just keep doing this. I'll get a master's in history and I'll study it some more. I wrote a thesis about priest sex abuse in Newfoundland and Ireland. Depressing and awful stuff, but the start of my interest in Irish history. And then I got a funded PhD program spot, and I knew I wanted to do sex history, and because that's all the history that I actually really care about. I'm actually a really terrible historian, unless it's sex history. My hope was that it would be less depressing, my PhD program, than my master's project, and the spoiler alert was that it really was not most of the time, because I ended up in court records, which are quite depressing in and of themselves. But I figured out pretty quickly that there was very little written on Irish sexuality. And so there you go, Bob's your uncle. I had a path, I had a clear road to some kind of success, and I followed some leads that I picked up in Dermot Ferreter's tome, Occasions of Sin, to the National Archives and pulled every single court record from 1885 to 1963, which was what was available to me in 2013, on gross indecency, sodomy, and indecent assault. When I got home, because I was poor, so I couldn't like live here forever. I lived here for 3 months, and I brought my partner, and he took pictures of everything with me, and he hated the whole trip because he was like, being a historian is really boring. I was like, what are you fucking talking about? Look at the dirt on my hands. Okay. But I put them all into what I would call my binders of men. I spent months building up a database of all the information that I could glean from 300 plus files that I found in the National Archives of Ireland. Compared to London, of course, or New York City, or even Warsaw in the same time period, this was not a lot of files, right? It felt like a lot to me because I didn't know anything, but the more that I understood the process of doing history and history of sexuality, like this was not a lot of files. But here was ample evidence of the policing of men who had sex with men, mostly those who did so in public spaces, like the lavatories and the parks and the alleyways of Dublin. Occasionally, though, also men who had sex with men in private. I assembled those statistics in my analysis of those cases, plus the longer history of homophobia as a tool of Irish nationalism, all into my dissertation. And then I got a job with a big teaching load, and I let my research sit for a bit, sort of marinate in my head. When I finally came back to the project, I fussed around with the first chapter and I sent it off for publication, and that came out in 2019 as a standalone article. It never really fit, it was like background to the broader project that I was doing with the dissertation, what became the book. And that same year, in 2019, I presented at the Queer History Conference in San Francisco, the first of its kind for the LGBTQ History Association of the United States, and I gave a paper about this tiny little case that I had sort of glossed over in the dissertation. That was Ronald Brown and Leslie Price. Ronald Brown was the state solicitor for Kildare. And he was in charge also, like he was very engaged in the Enoiga organization here in Dublin. But he got dragged into a gross indecency case when the young men he'd taken in, who was living with him in his rooms at Annoiga, was arrested in connection with a separate case with a very bad man who did a lot of other bad things. And so in digging into Brown for the conference paper, I realized that I'd actually gotten a few details wrong in my dissertation about him. And I then started to build out what I knew and what I could know about him into a new article. And that would eventually also become chapter 4 of the book. That project ended up being also the model for how I decided to approach the book project. Because in doing the research into Ronald Brown and Leslie Price, I utilized genealogical tools and what I call social biography in the title of the book, to try and figure out more about these people beyond these glimpses in the court records. I wanted to know them beyond the soulless reporting and statistics and trends and the modernization of the police force, although I still talk about the modernization of the police force in the book because I think the official photography of lavatories for evidence in gross indecency cases is actually endlessly fascinating and weird and creepy. And look at these pictures. They're so weird. Yeah. So I wanted to tell the stories of the people rather than the crimes necessarily. I wanted to think about, imagine even the lives of these men and these boys beyond the sad moments in court when their intimacies were trotted out in front of juries and judges, and when judges told them that they were disgusting, and guards harassed them in interrogations into confessing to what were life-altering and often life-ruining crimes, just for kissing another man who wanted it just as much. So I went back to my binders of men, and I found the most interesting, which often meant the best documented cases. And I followed those men out of their court records. Oops, oh God, do you see that? No, okay, good. I clicked the music, so hopefully nothing starts playing. Okay, I think we're safe. And I followed those men out of their court records and into the tenement houses and Annoiga hostels and terrace cottages of Dublin. There you go, that's one. I found their mothers and their fathers, their siblings, their birthdays and their gravestones, and every single mention in the newspapers about them that I could find. I came back to the archives. I found their petitions to the government for asylum. I found their last wills and testaments. I found their tins of lube. I found the deeds to their houses, and in the rarest of cases, I found their love letters. I did my best to extract from them the scant history of their own lives that they left behind so that their stories could ground the history I was extrapolating from the archives. Theirs are the stories that frame each of the chapters of my book. Dublin itself is a character in the book, and in chapter 1 I lay that groundwork, why the city was both Irish and not Irish, and why it still is and isn't, and how that shaped the policing of sex here in the Free State. In chapter 2, The Bait, I introduced Henry Coughlin, who met John Bodkin on O'Connell Street one night, and then arranged to meet him a few days later. They went to a lavatory behind the Bank of Ireland, not far from here. According to Bodkin, Coughlin put his arms around Bodkin, and they opened one another's trousers, and then only after Bodkin put his hand in contact with Coughlin's penis did Coughlin then tell Bodkin he was under arrest, because Coughlin, as it turned out, was a plainclothes guardie who took the job a little too seriously. Our friend James Hand is at the center of chapter 3, the cabbie. Ronald Brown, as I said, is the solicitor of chapter 4. Chapter 5 brings together several of Dublin's mid-century rent boys, some of whom haunted earlier chapters, like Michael Hackett, who was one of the rent boys who became a witness in the case against James Hand and his friend Frank North, and Leslie Price, who was Ronald Brown's lover, a 17-year-old English army deserter who tried to make it on his own, lied to the police constantly, got involved with the wrong people, and then found someone who cared about him and had to blow up both of their lives. I also discuss in that chapter Michael Nyan, who was a 15-year-old who hung out at the docks looking for a man to pick up instead of going to the docks to find work, which is what his father sent them there to do. Nyan is notable because he was the youngest person who I found in the records who was charged with gross indecency at 15. When he was found guilty, though, the judge was lenient on account of his age and just fined him and required that he keep the peace. And then his daddy showed up in court to pay the fine and take him home. And his father was a working class man, so you can imagine that the fine took a lot out of that family. So perhaps demonstrate something about family and the opportunity, or the possibilities of acceptance or forgiveness in this community. Chapter 6 follows a group of intergenerational guards. I call them Dublin's Vice Squad. They don't call themselves that officially, although maybe they did somewhere, it's just not in the records. Who spent the summer of 1950 surveilling Beresford Place. Remember this photo and this photo? They arrested nearly 50 men in 3 months just by watching this metal toilet a few nights a week. 2 of them would hang over the edge of the loop line bridge, so you can see that. That's the loop line bridge. It's kind of bright, but that's behind that car is the metal lav. And I think that's quite horrifying to be hanging off this. It's not a real bridge. I mean, it's a bridge for a train, so that seems pretty scary to me. But they did it anyway, a few nights a week for about 3 months. And in that time, they arrested nearly 50 men, just like putting a little bit of effort into the surveillance of one spot in Dublin. This was their view into the lav, and as one of the guards made quite clear in court, he could see the penises of men in these stalls quite clearly. I do find the dynamics that shape the formal policing of sex between men fascinating, so they're also part of the book. And then chapter 7 is about the love between Michal McLemore and Hilton Edwards. I found their letters in the National Library in August of 2023, which was a full decade after I'd started this research for my dissertation. And I was sitting there in the library just crying openly with some old white guy sitting over in the corner, like kind of concerned probably. But after 10 years of doing this work and having to wade through the muck of court records, it was just relief to find love in the archives that wasn't something I had to read between the lines of, that I didn't have to scrape and claw for every word. It was just love in its abject form. So I'm gonna end now. I have no idea how long I've been talking. I'm fine? Okay. I'm going to end now with a reading, just like 2 paragraphs, from the introduction of my book, because I feel like real authors get to do these talks and just like read full chapters to their audiences, which I didn't do. I was a little more informal, so you're welcome. But academic history writing is not probably the thing that you want to hear anyone read out loud anyway. So since you're a captive audience, I'll subject you to just a little bit of this pain with me. So Love in the Lav as a title represents equal parts author and subject. When I started research for this project in 2013, I went to the National Archives knowing I'd find something if I looked hard enough. It was in a public lavatory, described in Agarda testimony and crime scene photographs, that I found the first men whose experiences would drive my doctoral dissertation and now this book. The labor of love that is working on a project for over a decade is indescribable. For all that I mourn the disruption to their intimate moments, without these court records describing men having sex in lavatories, I wouldn't have even been able to get this far. I hope that the care and consideration that I put into writing about Dublin's same-sex desiring men, the Gardaí who policed them, and the teens who sold sex to them goes some way toward rectifying the wrongs of the past. More than simply revealing the extent of state-based violence against same-sex desiring men, I endeavor here to fold these men into Ireland's history. For my subjects, Love in the Lav nods not to the police officer's gaze, but to the reality of life for same-sex desiring men in Ireland and elsewhere in this period. Of course, Ireland, like most Christian-leaning countries in the 20th century, had both formal and informal modes of policing its citizens' sexuality. Gardaí enforced the law and moral regime by surveilling the spaces that men were known to cruise. The Catholic Church exerted its own influence both at the grassroots level, preaching brimstone and hellfire from the pulpit and in the confessional, and at the state level with its special place in the Irish 1937 Constitution. Between church and state, the two-pronged approach created an oppressive culture that ensured that ordinary queer Irish people without social status or wealth to protect, suffered. For some, perhaps even many, the only place they could find the physical touch they craved was in Dublin's public and urban spaces, in parks, alleyways, and yes, public lavatories. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think we're good to go. So we're going to speak for the next maybe 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for a Q&A from you all. I'm sure you have plenty of burgeoning questions, and also, if it hasn't been mentioned already, the book is available at the back. Make sure to buy a copy. Averill will be signing some books
my pen.
for you all. Make sure you get your pen. It's absolutely necessary. But just firstly, thank you, Averill, for this wonderful talk and letting myself and Tom come here and share in your big Irish launch. So what I wanted to kind of maybe say, just as a really quick observation, was, you reference it in the lecture there, but just how you were actually dealing with the dry documents, people at their worst moments via court records. And if you read the book, which I have, and the review is coming in the Irish Studies review soon, what you do really well, I think, is even at their worst moments, you bring through the social biography methodology, you bring a sense of humanity. You don't just treat these as numbers, figures, statistics of individuals at their, most humiliated, but you build their lives and give us a picture of who they were, the social realities in which they lived, and the kinds of relationships that were available to them at the time. So the book does that really well across each of the chapters. So that's why you should all buy it at the end. What I wanted to maybe ask you, and then Tom, maybe you might pick up the mantle, was my queer Irish history research is very much from the founding of the movement from 1973 up until the later 20th century. So I have the benefit of self-reflexive activists who are in the room right now, who documented their lives quite stringently. Members of the IGRM, the NGF, taking minutes of meetings that are currently available in the IQA. Lots of the people are still with us to actually get the oral histories out of them. So there's an abundance of material there. What are the struggles then when you're working in a context where all you have are the criminal records? And to build that life for us to read, what kind of insights could you give us in terms of writing the book in that context?
Yeah. Thank you, Páraic. That's a great question. So, and I think about this obviously a lot. And actually, I've been talking to my students on this trip because a few of them have asked, how do you feel about being the first-ish person to work on this material? And I said, well, it kind of made me lazy because I just went to the court records because no one had really done that, right? But that is the sort of thing that people do the first time a topic in a particular national or regional context is you go to, if it's criminalized, you go to the court records. And I had enough material there to write a dissertation, to get the PhD, to move on with my life. But then it wasn't enough, right? It wasn't enough for me to just leave it there with this sort of cold, empty factoids and statistics. I wanted to know these men and their lives, and like in the historiographical recovery history kind of methodology, I wanted to recover them from this state-imposed violence. And in some ways, my work has gone even beyond my imagination because now it's being read by legislators who are working on this disregard scheme to go back and look at all these men who were put in prison and or even just arrested under these laws and disregard their convictions, which I hope will then lead to reparations for their families because of the damage that these kinds of laws create in those communities. So it was my laziness, but it leads to what I hope will be greater visibility of that there is that the work that you are doing, that Patrick McDonough.
Yes.
Oh God, Patrick McDonough has done on the post 1974 stuff. Like that's also essential, and I'm so thankful for it because those stories need to be told. But I'm also hoping that I am not the last, right? Like that maybe I'm the first, but I'm not the last person to do this work, and that my work encourages families to donate, like, because queer people before 1974 also documented their lives, right? We have Kathleen Lynn's diaries in the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland that document her, like, literally undying love for Ellen French Mullen, right? And my student here is working on a paper, and Mary Metcalf is working on a book about this, right? Like, so queer people did document it. That's just, where are their materials? They're in attics. They're stashed away. I'm hoping that that's what they are, and they weren't destroyed by their families, right, in shame. But I'm hoping that this is the start of more, so that the next time I go to do a project, I can find those stories, not like scraping for every detail, but by reading their own words and their own reflections on their lives. Yeah, that was a long answer.
Maybe want to pick that up?
Yeah, I'd pick that up. Tom.
Sure, yeah. I thought I'd start with some observations that might be useful for people who are considering buying the book if you've not bought it already, and really to stress just how original and important it is. And I think that is something worth saying. And there's an academic cultural capital behind claiming to be the first to do something, or to say this is the first time this topic has been looked at. And many times that is exaggeration from publishers and sometimes authors. But in this case, it is true. And I received the proposal for this book from the publisher about 5 or so years ago. And immediately upon opening it, as someone who was working on similar topics but in the north of Ireland, I was amazed. I thought, wow, this really is the first time this has been done. And everything I'd read up until that point, there was this almost gaping cultural hole in the middle of the 20th century where I expected to see history and had not yet seen it until that point. And we knew quite a lot about early 20th century and late 19th century scandals. Some of you will be familiar with the Dublin Castle scandal, for example, in 1884, or the Crown Jewels scandal in 1904. And we're familiar with some of the revolutionary generation and brilliant work done by Mary that Averill mentioned before. And then everything seems to disappear until the emergence of the gay rights movement in the 1970s. So to see someone tackling that problem and putting so much work into it was a joy. And I'm so delighted that Averill managed to actually do that and to fulfill that promise. Above all, and this would be my second observation, is despite this often being a history of regulation, of how the state and its police controlled and governed the lives of men who committed the simple crime of desiring other men, it is also a story that is full of compassion, it's full of humanity, and not just in the subjects that we might expect to see it in the men who themselves were arrested, but the same sort of generosity and compassion that Averill has extended to the men who policed them as well, who were a product of their time as much as the men who were arrested. So there's a real generosity and humanity in the writing of this book, which, as Páraic said, the fact that it came from criminal records is immensely important. The ability to do that, and I think using family history as a method for that was absolutely vital. You know, that's what allows us to have that sort of view. And my final observation, maybe a slightly cheeky one, is it's good to see a book that's actually about sex. You know, I think we often know a lot about community and that tricky topic of identity, but we don't often know that much about where people met, what they did with each other. And at the end of the day, that is what made these people different to those around them. And that's what made them subject to religious, moral, and state authority. So we have to take it seriously and understand that, you know, to commit these crimes as they were at the time took a lot of, you know, chutzpah. I almost said another word there, but I know we're being filmed. You know, so this is important, to give serious attention to the fact that these are crimes, but of sexual passion, and to reveal that passion as far as is possible. So I do have questions as well, which I can go straight into before we pass over to the audience. I mean, you end the book by saying quite rightly that, you know, in a sense, you've set the groundwork here of the project. You've done that hard yards in the archive of unpicking the criminal archives. I wonder what you would say to future scholars of queer Dublin and maybe queer Ireland more broadly. Where do they need to go and look next?
Softballs, thanks, Tom. I think, well, I guess this is a great place to plug, again, the Oral History Project that the Dublin City Council and TCD and UCD and technically St. Olaf are spearheading now to try and recover some of the, we have a rich archive of activist stories, and now we need sort of ordinary people's stories to be able to tell those as well. So that, I think, is going to be an incredible resource for future generations, assuming we get people to sign up. So if you have friends and family, please pass the information on to them. But I also think that, right, again, I was the first, so I did the easy thing, which was the National Archives and the state records and the court records. But I haven't even scratched the surface of local archives, right? And I think that's hopefully where maybe people who are not me, because it can't just be me out here, people. We need others to do this work. Will pick up the thread and work on this, and perhaps even coming through, you know, Irish Americans in particular love to do genealogy projects, and I'm imagining that a number of them have genealogies that include queer people in those stories, and so I'm hoping that some of that comes out in the coming years as well, and maybe they'll find my book as a resource, and then they'll have a context to work within so that they can tell those stories and share them and maybe donate them so that they're accessible in places like Prony or the National Archives or the National Library, or they're, you know, in the Athlone Library or whatever it is, right? That's where some of those, I hope some of those stories are there. Finding them is another challenge. And then, of course, the Folklore Archive. As soon as I learn Irish, I'm gonna start digging into those with Tom, because he's not gonna learn Irish, so I'm gonna do all the work. And then we'll figure it out from there. Because there are stories there too, right? That young people went out in the 1920s and 40s and collected stories from their communities, and buried in there are queer stories. They weren't labeled thusly. Maybe they were by the person who indexed them, because they had a different perspective on what that meant than the people who were telling those stories. So that's something to look at too. That was a ramble. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks. I'm sure Kieran Rose is here, and actually the question relates to something that Kieran says at the start of his book, which I was rereading recently, and to my mind is probably the first gay rights history of Ireland, I think.
Yes.
To be fair in saying.
Yeah.
1994? 3?
93?
Yeah.
94.
And one of the things that Kieran says at the beginning of that book is, you know, he draws attention to a history of Irish tolerance, which I think is a really important thing that is sometimes forgotten in the writing of gay histories, where it's quite easy to find the negative and it's much harder to find the positive, or perhaps even just the indifferent. One of the things that really strikes me about Averill's book is the lack of complicity with local people with the policing of same-sex desire. That most people are not dobbing in their neighbours or their loved ones. You know, the police are having to stake out public toilets because they're not going to catch these people otherwise. So I wanted to ask Averill if you were surprised by that yourself, the sort of the level of non-complicity and the perhaps the tolerance we might see as an extension of that.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Especially because I started the history of Irish sexuality reading things about women's history, right? Like, and the way that families and priests and police put women in Magdalene institutions, right? Like, with nary a thought or care, really shockingly and horrifyingly. So I expected that same kind of attitude to extend to this, but in fact, unless it was children involved, and even then, not all children receive the same level of care, obviously. Hence the breaking of child sexual abuse scandals in the church. That for the most part, neighbors and friends and siblings and parents did not, right? I have to assume that James Hand's family knew what went on at his house, and they didn't show up for him in court the way that Michael Nyan's father did, but they didn't turn him in. It was his friend who he kept spreading rumors about, or gossiping about, right? And that went on, and his friend kept trying to tell him to stop and tried to get the priest to intervene. And even the priest knew what James Hand was doing with his house, and he didn't intervene either. It wasn't until finally his friend at his wit's end goes to the police and says, just so you know, James Hand is using his house as a brothel for men. And then a year later, when they brought that friend into court, he said, I wish I had never come to you, because this is not what I wanted. I just wanted him to, I was just mad at him. It was just a tiff. And now I regret everything, basically, right? So I think that, that was surprising that in Dublin, right, like the old adage is that you go to the city to find anonymity if you're queer. And I don't think that's true. I think Dublin's too small of a city to actually be anonymous. But I also think that neighbors and friends and families, particularly in working class communities, were stronger knit for their queer sons and brothers and husbands in some cases than I expected to find, which was really exciting.
What I found really interesting about the book, and Averill has really good use of diagrams and maps, because of the project in the Hirschfeld Centre, I'm really interested in space and place in Dublin, and you really do map at a very particular moment in Dublin's history, more broader, and its urban history, the gay spatiality. Where did people network? Where did they socialise? It was often around lavatories, toilets, the Phoenix Park. You kind of have all of this mapped out, and it's just really helpful just from a contemporary perspective to map that and kind of see how does that then translate as it develops towards the end of the 20th century. We have a somewhat of a kind of spine in Dublin from Street 66 to the George to Panty Bar, not necessarily a gayborhood as it were, but was that something that struck you when you were writing the book, that spatial relationship, the nature of space and place in terms of where these men congregated, and was that something you thought about?
Yes, so that's one of the reasons one of the first things I did was mapping using it was like 2015, there was a Geo Earth or something that I was using. And just seeing the sorts of concentration in particular of the dots where crimes were quote unquote committed. Obviously that says more about the policing itself than it does about what was most popular. These were the most popular places that the guards knew about, right? Beresford Place being the big spot because of that 3-month period in 1950 when they arrested all those men, which said to me that, on the guardy side, I feel like that was a moment where they were saying, hey, if we had resources, if you would let us hire the number of guards we need, look at how many of these vice creatures we could take off the streets. But they actually never had the resources to do the kind of policing that they were expected to do, or they even wanted to do, if that's what they wanted to do. Although I can imagine that being a man who is not into penises hanging over a bridge and looking at them in a toilet was probably not very pleasant work. But for the ones on the guards who were, I guess that's another story. I think that, I don't know if it really maps the actual popular cruising spots, and I really hope that there was enough of a network among queer men to be like, oh, don't go to this place this week because there have been plainclothes cops out there, so avoid it and go to these other places, right? What's really interesting to me is that pubs are not really places where men get arrested, but of course they're using them for these very reasons too, meeting, exchanging kisses or whatever it is in snugs. And yet those seem to be spaces that the guards are just not willing to infiltrate, which I think is really interesting for the most part in this period. Obviously they do a very different job during the gay rights movement, right? So the contrast is really stark. And that it's these lavatories and the alleyways that are concentrated around working class neighborhoods, right? Like in the Liberties and in the streets leading in the old Georgian tenement buildings, like a stone's throw from where Michal McLemore and Hilton Edwards lived, were these poorer neighborhoods where men were being arrested. While these two men are living together in a coupledom for their literally entire lives, right? So the space question is something that's really interesting, and I think that's why, in many ways, Dublin is a character in the book, because it provides those spaces. And there's John Bodkin, who is the man who was entrapped by Henry Coughlin in the 1930s. He, because he thought he was on a date, was like, oh, you guys are so lucky here. In the country, we're always being watched. The irony being, of course, he said that as he was about to be entrapped into a crime. But like that concept that this is a space that did provide that kind of opportunity is, I think, essential to the work. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I think, sort of building on that, I was really struck by the importance of social class and how that did and didn't structure relationships throughout the period you're looking at, but often in quite divergent ways. So working class men could much more expected to be arrested because of the places they were meeting.
Yeah.
Middle class men could sometimes, and upper class men could use the power and authority that came with their social position to perhaps gain more lenient treatment. But it did seem to be the case that those from a higher class who found themselves in trouble, they really suffered afterwards in terms of like their reputational ruin.
Yeah.
I can't remember the exact quote, but Oscar Wilde, we can't have a gay book launch without talking about Oscar Wilde, but Oscar Wilde has a quote along the lines of, you know, working class families don't care if their son has been in prison. You know, that's the norm for them. They, you know, that's the state doing what it does. However, a middle class man, that's the end of their life. So there's a really interesting way that class works, and it means, like you say, Edwards and Millimore, as long as they're not sort of outraging public decency, the privacy of the middle class home allows them to live as they want.
Yeah.
But, you know, working class man, perhaps married, many children, or living with siblings, much, much more difficult.
Yeah.
I did have one more question that sort of relates to, you know, this is a micro-historical study in a way in that it focuses in on one city and the spaces within it. But given what we know about Ireland as a sort of migration society, or emigration society, you know, what role did movement and maybe the outside world, to put it grandly, what role did that sort of play in the lives of your characters?
Yeah, so this is a hard question to answer, and I wish I knew more, but I think that probably most of the men that I cover in the book, their stories are not findable in the public record in Ireland because they did emigrate to other places where I don't have access yet to their records. Like James Hand, who just disappears from the, like he doesn't die? No, of course he could be a vampire. But he probably is dead, and I hope he found, you know, some kind of second life somewhere else, whether it was Australia or if he fled to London or wherever. The one that I was able to track down because he was middle class, right, was Ronald Brown, who after the Gardaí and the Attorney General's office like jumped through 1,000 hoops to prove that he was innocent, even though he quite clearly was not. He was forced to resign, basically, from his position. He obviously was not allowed to live at Anoiga House anymore. And he ended up moving to what started out as a hostelry when he was there in the first decade, but then became a Buddhist temple in England, right? And that is where he died, and I contacted them in 2016 or something, and they said there were a few people there who remembered him, even though he had died in like the 80s or 90s, and they said he was erudite and always had a book for you. So just like a sweet man who everyone liked, and his life, his family disowned him, right? His prominent family from Nath disowned him. The person who paid for his death notice was his friend, Heinrich Petrie, who had given testimony in his favor in court in 1941. And so that was what he had left, was his friends, but his middle-class family sent him packing, right? So I think, yeah, the class element is there, right? Michael Nyhan's father showed up for him in court and paid the fine, even though it probably was like a huge chunk of whatever meager savings they had. And Ronald Brown, State Solicitor of Kildare, lost everything.
Okay, so I think it's about time for some audience questions. I
Yeah,
just have two small things for you before we get to
God.
the audience questions. Firstly, really briefly, a last one for me. What surprised you most about, what was the biggest surprise you got in the archive?
Oh my God.
Okay.
I mean, the literal biggest surprise was going through these court records and opening up an envelope, which I probably wasn't supposed to do, and finding a tin of lube with a giant swipe out of it that was kept as evidence for 70 years. Or, you know, it's still there. You can go and find it. I encourage you all to go pull that record. Maybe someday they'll make a special exhibit to it in the National Archives, as it should be. That's its pride of place. It should be on display.
That's going to do it.
Yep, there you go. This is the moment, everybody. Go request it. That's the biggest surprise. But like in terms of surprises in material, I think probably following the trajectory of Ronald Brown to its conclusion, and then being like, oh, dissertation mistakes. That's why I'm like, please don't read my dissertation. Just wait for the book. It's coming out soonish. It's so embarrassing because there's little errors in there, maybe like a lot of them. But it's, yeah, so in being able to rectify that, because I think that story is just wild and says a lot about Ireland during the emergency, during this period of neutrality, as the state is projecting this separation from England, but also here their state solicitor is caught up in this major scandal, and they're doing everything they can to like make sure it doesn't actually blow into a scandal, is fascinating to me.
Okay. The second one, I was going to get you perhaps to introduce the Oral History Project. We might do that as a wrap up at the end after the questions, or do you want to do it now?
Let's do it now.
Perfect.
Let's do it now. Yeah. So as I've mentioned, and as Charles has mentioned a couple of times, we have this Oral History Project. This today is the official launch. So yay! And I want to make sure that you get a chance to see Abby. Oh, there you are, Abby O'Reilly. We're going to stand up. Stand up. Stand up. Everybody look at Abby. So Abby is going to be doing the interviews for this first phase of the project for the Dublin focus. So has been doing lots of training, is very excited. We've been workshopping like questions and all these things for months now, and this has been a very long process. And we're very happy to finally, like 2 years we've been working on getting this thing off the ground. And we want to capture all of these stories before they are lost. So thank you, everyone. And take a flyer and tell everyone you know.